The fluorescent lights in the ICU cast everything in shades of sterile blue, and Eleanor felt the exhaustion in her bones as she clipped her badge to her scrubs and accepted the tablet from the charge nurse. Another night shift. Another 12 hours of monitoring machines and bodies hovering between life and death. She had been doing this for 6 years, and some nights, the weight of it pressed so heavily, she wondered if compassion had a limit, if she would wake up one morning and find hers completely depleted. The charge nurse, a severe woman named Margaret, tapped the screen with one manicured nail and said Eleanor would be covering the isolated wing tonight, room lodged in the secure corridor, no other patients nearby. Eleanor frowned and asked what kind of case required that level of separation. Margaret's expression went carefully blank. Gunshot wounds, medically induced coma, VIP patient, no questions, no visitors without clearance, armed security on site. Eleanor felt something cold move through her stomach. She had heard rumors about the private hospital accepting patients from the city's darker corners, men whose money bought silence and discretion, but she had never been assigned one directly. She nodded and took the tablet, her fingers trembling slightly as she walked toward the isolated wing. The corridor grew quieter with each step, the usual sounds of the ICU fading behind her until there was only the whisper of her shoes against linoleum and the thundering of her own heartbeat. Two men flanked the door to room 12, and they were not hospital security. They wore dark suits that could not conceal the shape of weapons beneath, and their eyes tracked her approach with the flat assessment of predators evaluating prey. She stopped a few feet away and held up her badge. Eleanor Ashworth, registered nurse, assigned to this patient. The taller one, a man with gray threaded through his dark hair and a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, studied her badge and then her face. He nodded once and stepped aside. She pushed through the door into dimness, broken only by the glow of monitors and the single lamp in the corner. The man in the bed stole her breath. Even unconscious, even with the ventilator tube and the bandages wrapping his torso and the IV lines snaking into his arms, he was the most striking man she had ever seen. Dark hair fell across a forehead, too pale, sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw shadowed with several days of stubble. A mouth that even in sleep looked firm and unyielding. She moved closer, checking the monitors with professional efficiency, noting his vitals, the dosages, the steadiness of his sedation. Alexander Tremayne. The name on the chart meant nothing to her, but the careful blankness in Margaret's eyes suggested it should. Eleanor adjusted his blanket and checked the dressing on his shoulder, where one bullet had torn through muscle and bone. Her shift blurred into routine. She checked on him every hour, adjusting medications, monitoring outputs, recording data with mechanical precision. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Eleanor barely slept during her days off, and when she did, she dreamed of that smile, the impossible curve of Alexander Tremayne's lips in response to her touch. She told herself repeatedly that exhaustion had created the illusion, that medically induced comas did not allow for conscious responses, that she had imagined the whole thing because she was overwrought and drained from back-to-back shifts and the emotional weight of watching a man hover so close to death. But the certainty lived in her chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable. She tried researching him during her waking hours, sitting in her cramped apartment with her laptop balanced on her thighs, typing his name into search engines and finding almost nothing. A few mentions in society pages from years ago, attending charity galas with beautiful women whose smiles looked brittle and performative. A single photograph of him in a tuxedo, his expression unreadable, his eyes cold even in the carefully staged shot. Then the trail went dead, scrubbed clean as if someone had methodically erased his digital footprint. The absence of information felt more ominous than any lurid headline could have been. When she returned to the hospital for her next shift, the guards outside room 12 watched her with an intensity that prickled across her skin. The tall one with the scar. He tracked her every movement as she approached, and something in his gaze suggested he saw more than a nurse doing her rounds. She nodded to him and entered the room, her pulse jumping unevenly. Alexander lay exactly as she had left him, pale and still, the machines breathing for him, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. She went through her checks, her hands steady despite the tremor she felt internally. Dr. Pembroke appeared halfway through her shift, a silver-haired man with sharp eyes and a reputation for discretion that made him valuable to certain clientele. He stood in the doorway and told her in a voice stripped of inflection that she should provide excellent care and ask absolutely no questions about this patient, that some situations required professional distance, that her job was to monitor vitals and administer medications and nothing more. She nodded and said she understood, and he left without another word, but the warning sat heavy in her stomach. That night she found herself talking to Alexander as she worked, filling the silence with details of her day, telling him about the terrible coffee in the break room and the argument between two residents over a diagnosis, and the way the sunrise had painted the sky in shades of amber and rose as she drove home that morning. She told him about her student loans, the crushing debt that kept her working nights for the pay differential, about her apartment that was too small and too expensive, but was hers. She mentioned almost absently that the parking garage had felt particularly ominous lately, that she had taken to clutching her keys between her fingers like a weapon, that she hated feeling afraid in spaces she navigated every day. The heart monitor spike was sharp and sudden, his pulse jumping from 68 to 94 in seconds. Eleanor froze, her eyes locked on the screen, watching the numbers. No other vitals changed. Respiration steady. Blood pressure stable, just his heart, racing. She turned slowly to look at his face. Nothing. No movement, no flutter of eyelids, no tension in his jaw. But she knew. Somehow, impossibly, he was listening. Eleanor began testing her theory with the careful methodology of someone who knew she was crossing into territory that defied everything her medical training had taught her, and over the next 3 shifts, she observed patterns that should have been impossible. When other nurses entered the room for their rotations, she lingered nearby, watching the monitors from the hallway, noting that his heart rate remained steady at 68, his respiration unchanged, his blood pressure a consistent 118/76. But when she entered, when her voice filled the space with updates or observations, or the small mundane details of her life, his vitals shifted subtly, his heart rate dropping to 64, his breathing deepening almost imperceptibly, as if her presence brought him something close to peace. She started arriving 15 minutes early to her shifts, just to see the change happen in real time, watching the numbers adjust as she greeted him and touched his hand. The connection she felt terrified her because it made no scientific sense, because she was a woman who believed in evidence and data and the concrete reality of medicine. Yet here she was falling into something that felt like intimacy with an unconscious man she knew nothing about, except that he was dangerous and someone wanted him dead. On the 4th night, the guard with the scar stopped her in the hallway outside room 12. And she realized with a start that she had never learned his name despite passing him dozens of times. He introduced himself as Henry Carstairs, his voice low and edged with something that might have been curiosity or suspicion, and he asked her directly what she discussed with Mr. Tremayne during her shifts. Eleanor felt her pulse spike and forced herself to meet his eyes without flinching, telling him she provided updates on his condition, explained procedures, spoke to him the way she spoke to all comatose patients, because studies showed that familiar voices could aid recovery. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but Henry studied her for a long moment before nodding and stepping aside, though she felt his gaze follow her into the room like a physical weight. That night, she locked the door from the inside, knowing the guards had keys but needing the illusion of privacy, and she moved to Alexander's bedside and took his hand between both of hers. She leaned close enough to smell the antiseptic and the faint scent of his skin beneath it, and whispered that she thought he could hear her, that his body responded to her voice in ways that suggested awareness, that she did not understand how or why, but she believed he was trapped somewhere between consciousness and darkness, listening. She told him she would keep his secret, that she would not report the anomalies in his vitals, that whatever was happening between them would remain between them. His finger twitched against her palm, a single deliberate movement that sent electricity racing up her arm and stealing the air from her lungs. She gasped and stared at their joined hands, watching for another sign. And when it came, when his index finger curled slowly around hers in something that felt impossibly like reassurance, she understood that she had crossed a line she could never uncross, that this dangerous unconscious stranger had reached through the dark and claimed something essential from her, and the terror and thrill of it made her feel more alive than she had in years. Eleanor was reviewing medication charts at the nurse's station when movement in her peripheral vision snagged her attention, and she glanced up to see an orderly she did not recognize pushing a supply cart toward room 12, his gait smooth and purposeful in a way that felt wrong, too controlled, too deliberate for someone performing routine tasks at 2 in the morning. The hospital employed dozens of support staff across multiple shifts, but she had worked nights long enough to know the regulars, to recognize faces and gaits, and the particular way each person moved through the hallways. And this man was a stranger, his scrubs too new, his shoes too quiet, his eyes fixed on Alexander's door with an intensity that made something primal spike in her chest. Instinct screamed danger before conscious thought could catch up, and she abandoned her charts and followed him down the corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs, watching as he nodded to the guards with a familiarity that somehow granted him passage. Henry was not at his usual post, and the replacement guards were younger, less certain, and they stepped aside as the orderly offered some explanation Eleanor could not hear. She quickened her pace and pushed through the door just as the stranger withdrew a syringe from his cart, the liquid inside pale and viscous, his hand already reaching for the IV port that would deliver whatever poison he carried directly into Alexander's bloodstream. Eleanor did not think, did not pause to consider the danger or her own vulnerability. She simply lunged forward and grabbed his wrist, her voice loud and sharp, as she demanded to know what he thought he was doing, what medication he was administering without authorization. The man's eyes went cold and flat, and he backhanded her with his free hand, the impact snapping her head to the side and filling her mouth with the copper taste of blood, and he hissed that she should have minded her own business, that she was collateral damage now. Eleanor staggered but threw herself at the emergency alarm on the wall, slamming her palm against the red button, and the room exploded with sound, shrill and piercing, flooding the hallway beyond with light and noise. The assassin lunged for her, and she stumbled backward against Alexander's bed, her hand instinctively reaching for his, gripping tight as if he could anchor her, and the monitors erupted into chaos, Alexander's heart rate spiking to 140, alarms layering over alarms. The door crashed open and Henry appeared with 3 other guards, weapons drawn, and the fake orderly tried to run, but Henry moved with brutal efficiency. A single shot dropping the man before he reached the threshold, blood spreading across the sterile floor in a dark pool. Eleanor could not look away from the body, her breathing ragged, her hands still locked around Alexander's, and his vitals were screaming, his heart racing, his blood pressure climbing to dangerous levels, as if his unconscious mind understood the threat, understood how close death had come. Henry barked orders, and the guard secured the room while he moved to Eleanor, his hand surprisingly gentle as he checked her face where the assassin had struck. But she shook her head and turned to Alexander, leaning over him, her voice breaking as she told him he was safe, that the danger had passed, that she was right here and would not leave. Slowly, impossibly, his vitals began to stabilize, his heart rate dropping degree by degree as her voice washed over him, and Henry stood back watching with an expression that mingled respect and suspicion, and something that might have been understanding, as if he finally saw what his boss had recognized from the beginning, that this woman was not just a nurse, but something essential, something worth protecting, something dangerous in her own quiet way. Eleanor was summoned to the chief nursing officer's sterile administrative suite at 7 the following morning. Her shift barely ended, exhaustion clinging to her bones and the bruise on her cheekbone darkening to purple. And Margaret Chen sat behind a polished desk with the kind of expression that meant decisions had already been made without input from those most affected. Margaret explained in carefully neutral tones that given the violent incident in room 12, the administration felt it best to reassign Eleanor to a different unit for her own protection. That her dedication was admirable, but her safety could not be guaranteed while caring for such a high-risk patient. And Eleanor felt panic claw up her throat at the thought of being separated from Alexander, of abandoning him to strangers who would not speak to him, who would not anchor him through the darkness. She opened her mouth to protest, but the door opened behind her, and Henry Carstairs entered without knocking, his presence filling the room with quiet authority. And he informed Margaret with perfect politeness that Mr. Tremayne's medical team had noted significant stability in his vitals, specifically correlated to Nurse Ashworth's presence. That removing her from his care would be medically inadvisable, that his recovery depended on continuity, and her removal could trigger complications the hospital would find legally problematic. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she nodded after a long, tense moment, and Eleanor was dismissed with instructions to take the rest of the day to recover and return for her next scheduled shift. Henry walked her to the elevator in silence. And once the doors closed, he told her quietly that she had made herself visible, that his employer's enemies now knew her face, that her life had become complicated in ways she might not fully understand yet. Eleanor met his gaze and asked if that was a threat, and Henry actually smiled, a brief flash of something almost like approval, and said it was a statement of fact, that she had proven herself loyal and brave, and those qualities were rare and valued. But they also came with consequences. She returned to her apartment as dawn broke over the city, her mind spinning with the realization that she was no longer simply a nurse doing her job, that she had been pulled into Alexander Tremayne's world by choices both deliberate and instinctive, and she could not identify the moment when professional duty had transformed into something far more dangerous. She showered and climbed into bed, but sleep eluded her, her thoughts circling back to the way Alexander's vitals had spiked when she was threatened, the way they had calmed only to her voice, and she wondered what it meant that an unconscious man fought harder for her safety than anyone ever had in her waking life. That night she returned to room 12 and found Henry at his post, 2 additional guards flanking the door, security visibly heightened. And when she entered Alexander's room and took his hand in greeting, his fingers closed around hers immediately, not a twitch or a flutter, but a deliberate, sustained grip, warm and firm and unmistakably intentional. Her breath caught, and she whispered his name, searching his face for any other sign of awareness. And though his eyes remained closed and his expression peaceful, she felt the pressure of his hold increase fractionally, as if in response, in acknowledgement, in connection. She sank into the chair beside his bed without releasing him, and admitted in a whisper meant only for him that she felt something she had no right to feel. That this man she knew only through silence and stolen moments had claimed a piece of her heart she had not known was available. And the confession terrified her because it made her vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with assassins or danger, in ways that cut far deeper than any physical threat ever could. Eleanor overheard the truth about Alexander Tremayne in the staff break room 3 nights later, 2 surgical nurses speaking in low tones over lukewarm coffee, their words painting a picture of a man who controlled territory and operations across half the city, whose name made hardened criminals look over their shoulders, whose reputation was built on calculated violence and an iron code of loyalty that his organization followed without question. They spoke of gang wars and territory disputes, of politicians in his pocket and judges who owed him favors, of a criminal empire so sophisticated it operated like a corporation with Alexander at its head, untouchable and feared in equal measure. Eleanor stood frozen behind the partition with her microwave dinner cooling in her hands, listening to descriptions of the man whose hand she held each night, and she waited for terror to flood her system, for survival instinct to kick in and scream at her to run. Instead, she felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her chest, an irrational need to defend him against their gossip, even though every word was likely true, and she realized with startling clarity that she had moved past the point where his darkness could drive her away. She returned to room 12 and found him as she always did, still and silent in the hospital bed. But now, when she looked at him, she saw both versions, the vulnerable patient and the dangerous king, and somehow the contradiction made him more real, more human, more worth the risk she was taking by caring. She settled into her chair and pulled a book from her bag, a collection of poetry she had loved in college, and began to read aloud, her voice soft in the quiet room, filling the silence with rhythm and imagery and beauty. His hand found hers within 2 stanzas, that now familiar grip that told her he was present, listening, connected to her across the barrier of consciousness. She read for an hour and then set the book aside and began to describe what she had seen on her drive to work, the way autumn was painting the trees in shades of amber and crimson, the crispness in the air that promised winter, the way the city looked at night from the highway with all its lights spreading like stars across the landscape. She told him about the small things, the mundane details of a life continuing outside his window, and his breathing would shift when she spoke, deepening or quickening in response to her tone. Over the following nights, she brought different books, novels and short stories and essays, anything to give him connection to the world beyond his darkness, and she found herself arriving early for her shifts, staying late after they ended, stealing every possible moment in his presence. She would squeeze his hand and feel the answering pressure, stronger each time, more deliberate, and she began to map his responses like a secret language only they shared. Her days off became empty stretches of time she endured rather than enjoyed, counting down hours until she could return to room 12, to him, to the strange intimacy they had built in silence. She knew it was dangerous, this craving for a man she had never spoken with in any conventional sense, but she had stopped lying to herself about what she felt, had stopped pretending this was only professional duty or compassionate care. Dr. Pembroke summoned Eleanor to his office during her break on a Wednesday evening, his expression grave behind wire-rimmed glasses, and he informed her that Alexander Tremayne's neurological scans showed significantly increased brain activity, that the pattern suggested he was naturally emerging from the coma state, that the medical team planned to begin reducing his sedation within 48 hours to allow him to wake. Eleanor felt her stomach drop and her pulse spike, anticipation and terror colliding in her chest, because waking meant everything would change. The fragile, intimate world they had built in his darkness would shatter, and she would have to face the reality of who he truly was, what he would remember, whether the connection she felt was mutual or merely her own desperate fantasy projected onto an unconscious man who had no choice but to accept her presence. She thanked Dr. Pembroke with a voice that sounded steady, despite the chaos in her mind, and returned to her rounds, moving through the motions mechanically, while her thoughts spun in endless circles. That night, she stood outside room 12 for a full 3 minutes before entering, Henry watching her with knowing eyes from his post, and when she finally pushed through the door, Alexander lay as he always did, peaceful and still, beautiful even in vulnerability, and she wondered if this would be one of the last nights she would have him like this, hers alone in the quiet hours. She completed his vital checks and then sat in her chair and took his hand, his fingers closing around hers immediately with that strength that had grown so familiar, and she realized she needed to speak the truth before he woke, before he became fully himself, and she lost her courage. She told him in a whisper that she knew what he was, that Henry and the other guards and the whole careful constructed security around him made it clear he was dangerous, powerful, someone she should fear. But she felt safer sitting beside his bed in the middle of the night than she had ever felt walking through her own neighborhood or lying alone in her apartment. She confessed that she did not understand how this had happened. how a man she had never had a real conversation with had become the center of her world, how his silent presence had filled spaces in her heart she had not known were empty. She admitted that when he woke, she did not know what would happen, whether he would dismiss her as simply the nurse who had done her job, whether he would even remember her voice in his darkness, and the uncertainty terrified her more than any threat from his enemies ever could. She lifted his hand to her lips and pressed a kiss to his knuckles, letting it linger this time, a deliberate echo of that first unconscious gesture weeks ago that had started everything, and she felt his fingers tighten against hers. His eyes moved beneath closed lids, rapid fluttering movement that made her breath catch, and for a moment she thought he might wake right then, that she would have to meet his gaze and see recognition or confusion or nothing at all. But he stilled again, and she sat holding his hand until her shift ended at dawn, memorizing the feel of him, preparing herself for everything to change. Eleanor was 20 minutes late to her shift because of traffic on the bridge, her heart racing with anxiety about the sedation reduction scheduled for earlier that day. And when she pushed through the hospital entrance, Henry was already waiting in the lobby instead of at his usual post, his expression unreadable as he moved toward her with purposeful strides that made her stomach clench with dread. He said nothing, only gestured for her to follow, and she abandoned the elevator for the stairs because waiting felt impossible, her mind spinning through terrible possibilities, that Alexander had crashed during emergence, that complications had arisen, that he had woken and immediately demanded she be removed from his care, that the connection she felt had been entirely one-sided delusion. Henry led her directly to room 12 and opened the door, stepping aside, and she walked through on legs that trembled to find the bed elevated at 45 degrees and Alexander Tremayne fully conscious, awake, alert, sitting upright with his gray eyes locked on the door like he had been waiting specifically for her arrival. The air evacuated her lungs in a rush. She had thought him beautiful unconscious, but awake, he was utterly devastating, those storm-colored eyes burning with an intensity that pinned her in place more effectively than any physical restraint, sharp intelligence and controlled power radiating from him even in his weakened state. And she understood in that moment why men feared him, why his name carried weight in the criminal underworld, because everything about him projected absolute authority and dangerous capability. He studied her with the same focus she imagined he turned on enemies and allies alike, his gaze tracking over her face and body with thorough assessment that made her skin heat, and she stood frozen just inside the door while her mind struggled to reconcile the vulnerable patient she had cared for with this formidable man who watched her like she was the only thing in the room that mattered. His voice, when he finally spoke, was exactly as she had imagined during all those hours of one-sided conversation, low and rough from disuse, but carrying an edge of dark silk that slid over her nerve endings and made her shiver. He said her name first, Eleanor, not Miss Ashworth or nurse, just her given name spoken with certainty and possession, and then he told her in that compelling voice that she had saved his life twice, once when she stopped the assassin, and once every single night when she pulled him back from the void with her words and her presence and her touch, that her voice had been the only light in his darkness, that he had heard every story she told and every confession she whispered and every moment she spent keeping him tethered to the world. She tried to speak and found her voice had abandoned her entirely, her throat tight with emotion and fear and something that felt dangerously like hope. And Alexander's lips curved into that slight smile she had first seen weeks ago, the expression transforming his severe features into something almost gentle, devastating in its intimacy, because she knew that smile, had seen it directed at her in his unconscious vulnerability, and now his eyes were open and watching her with heat and gratitude and an intensity that promised everything had changed, but perhaps not in the way she feared. Eleanor arrived for her shift the following evening to find the entire administrative staff in chaos, nurses whispering in clusters near the station, and Dr. Pembroke emerging from a closed-door meeting with an expression somewhere between stunned and resigned. and when she approached cautiously, he informed her that effective immediately, she was being reassigned exclusively to patient Alexander Tremayne in room 12, that the arrangement had been requested specifically, and that a substantial donation to the hospital's new surgical wing had accompanied the request, making refusal impossible from an institutional perspective, though he wanted to ensure she consented personally to the change. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks because the implications were clear to everyone watching, that somehow she had become personally important to the dangerous man recovering in the isolated wing. And she nodded agreement because refusing felt both impossible and dishonest when she had spent weeks counting down hours until she could return to his side. She made her way to room 12, where Henry stood outside looking even more imposing than usual, and he opened the door for her with something that might have been approval in his typically blank expression, and she entered to find Alexander awake and alert, his color better today, strength returning visibly to his frame, though he still moved with careful deliberation that spoke of healing injuries. She opened her mouth to protest the arrangement, to say she was not a private nurse and this was inappropriate and she had other patients who needed care, but Alexander simply looked at her with those storm-gray eyes that saw too much, his gaze steady and patient and utterly immovable, and her words dried up completely because arguing with him felt like standing before an approaching storm and demanding it change course. He asked if she would continue reading to him, his voice still rough but growing stronger, and requested she tell him more about her life, the details she had shared in his darkness, and Eleanor sank into the chair she had occupied for weeks and pulled the current novel from her bag with hands that trembled slightly. Over the following hours between medical checks and medication administration, she read 3 chapters while Alexander listened with complete focus, his eyes tracking her face rather than the book, and when she set it aside, he began asking questions that felt far too personal for a patient and nurse, wanting to know why she lived alone, why she worked nights instead of days, what dreams she had abandoned to pay off student loans, what fears kept her awake during the day when she should be sleeping. She answered haltingly at first, and then with more ease because he listened with genuine interest, no judgment in his expression, only focused attention that made her feel seen in a way she had not experienced in years. Henry entered twice during the shift bringing updates delivered in code Eleanor did not fully understand, but she realized from the deference in his posture and tone that Henry was not simply a guard but something more, second in command perhaps, the trusted lieutenant of a dangerous organization, and that made Alexander's constant dismissal of anyone except her presence even more significant, because this was a man accustomed to absolute authority, who chose to be vulnerable only with her. Eleanor discovered the surveillance on her 4th day as Alexander's exclusive nurse when she returned home after her shift, and found a black sedan parked across from her apartment building, with 2 men inside who made no effort to hide their presence, and when she mentioned it casually the next evening while checking Alexander's incision sites, his expression remained calm, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes as he asked if the men had approached her or made her feel unsafe. She said no, but asked pointedly if he knew anything about them, and the silence that followed confirmed everything before he spoke, his voice even and unapologetic as he explained that yes, he had assigned protection to her building and her route to work, that she had made herself his responsibility when she stepped between him and an assassin, that his world did not operate on polite boundaries and second chances, that debts were remembered and paid in his organization, and she had earned his protection whether she wanted it or not. Eleanor felt fury ignite in her chest, hot and bright, because this was exactly the kind of high-handed controlling behavior she should have expected from a man accustomed to absolute authority, and she told him in a voice shaking with anger that he had no right to invade her privacy, to make decisions about her safety without her consent, that she was not some possession to be guarded and managed, but a person with autonomy who had lived perfectly well before he entered her life. Alexander listened without interruption, his gray eyes tracking her face as she paced the small room. And when she finally ran out of words, he simply stated in that dark silk voice that she was correct. He was arrogant and controlling, that he would not apologize for protecting what mattered to him, that his enemies now knew she had value to him, and that made her a target regardless of her wishes or his preferences. That she could be angry about the surveillance, but he would not remove it because her safety outweighed her pride and his own sense of propriety. She wanted to throw something at his maddeningly calm expression, to make him understand that she was not a piece on his chessboard to be moved and protected. But before she could unleash another wave of anger, he asked quietly, his voice dropping to something almost vulnerable, if she regretted the kisses she had pressed to his hand during his unconsciousness. If she wished she had maintained professional distance and never let herself care about the dangerous man in room 12. The question disarmed her completely, all her righteous fury deflating as she stared at him, at the intensity in his eyes that belied his calm exterior, and she realized he was not asking about surveillance or protection, but about something far more fundamental, whether she regretted the connection that had formed between them in darkness and vulnerability. She could not lie, not to him, not about this, and she whispered no. She did not regret those kisses, or the words she had spoken, or the nights she had spent pulling him back from the void. And something in his expression shifted, softened, a hint of that slight smile curving his lips as he told her. Then she would have to accept that he could not regret protecting her, that everything he did now was because she had chosen to care, and he refused to let that compassion destroy her. Dr. Pembroke arrived during Eleanor's shift 3 days later with discharge paperwork and a grave expression, informing them that Alexander was medically cleared to leave the hospital, though he recommended another week of observation. But Eleanor could see in his careful neutrality that the recommendation would be ignored, because men like Alexander Tremayne did not linger in vulnerable positions once mobility returned. Alexander accepted the paperwork with barely a glance, his attention fixed on Eleanor as she prepared his final round of medications, and she felt the weight of approaching separation like a physical ache, because once he left this room, their strange, intimate bubble would burst, and he would return to his dangerous world, while she returned to her small, colorless life. Henry entered without knocking, and exchanged a brief, tense conversation with Alexander, in voices too low for Eleanor to hear properly, though she caught fragments about movements and timelines and increased activity. And when Henry left, Alexander's expression had hardened into something cold and calculating that reminded her forcefully that this was not simply a recovering patient, but a man who commanded criminal empires. He told her without preamble that she needed to come with him to his estate, that the situation had escalated beyond simple surveillance, that his enemies were making moves, and she was now a identified vulnerability they would exploit. Eleanor felt her spine stiffen as she turned to face him fully, her voice steady despite her racing heart as she refused, explaining that she had a life and a job and an apartment, that she was not some chess piece to be relocated at his convenience, that she had survived 28 years without his protection and would continue surviving after he left. Alexander did not argue or raise his voice, simply gestured to Henry, who had returned carrying a manila folder, and when Henry placed it on the table and opened it, Eleanor felt ice flood her veins, because the photographs inside showed her apartment building from multiple angles, her car in the parking garage, herself walking to work, and in every image there were other figures circled in red, different men at different times, but always watching, always following. Henry's voice was professionally detached as he explained these were not Alexander's people, but members of the Valdez organization, the rival faction responsible for putting Alexander in the hospital, and their presence indicated clear intent to leverage her as either bait or revenge. Eleanor's hands trembled as she flipped through image after image, seeing her routine life transformed into a hunting ground, recognizing several of the men from her apartment building where she had assumed they were normal residents, and fury warred with fear in her chest, because this was exactly what she had tried to avoid, this loss of autonomy and safety that came from caring about someone dangerous. Alexander watched her process the reality with those storm-gray eyes that missed nothing, And when she finally looked up, he stated quietly that he was offering his protection with no conditions except her safety, that his estate had security measures that made infiltration nearly impossible, that she could hate him for the disruption, but he would not apologize for keeping her alive. She wanted to refuse again, to cling to her independence even as the photographs proved that independence was an illusion now, and the words stuck in her throat because staying meant stepping fully into his world while leaving meant gambling with her life against enemies who had already proven their ruthlessness. She heard herself agree to 1 week, just until the immediate threat passed, and saw something flicker in Alexander's expression that might have been relief or triumph or both, and she knew with sinking certainty that 1 week would change everything between them in ways she could not yet imagine. Alexander's estate materialized through the darkness like something from another world, all stone and iron and silent watchfulness, the main house illuminated against the night sky with warm light spilling from tall windows that spoke of wealth so casual it needed no announcement. And Eleanor sat frozen in the back of the armored car as Henry drove through 3 separate security checkpoints, each manned by professionals whose eyes tracked their progress with the kind of alertness that came from expecting threats at any moment. The interior overwhelmed her senses when Alexander led her inside, his hand light against her lower back as though he feared she might bolt, and she supposed she might have if not for those photographs still burned into her memory. Every room decorated with understated elegance that whispered old money and careful taste, the kind of luxury that made her worn scrubs and second-hand coat feel like costume pieces from a different production entirely. Alexander showed her to a suite on the second floor that was larger than her entire apartment, all cream and gold and soft textures. And when he quietly mentioned that his own rooms were directly across the hall, something in his expression suggested the proximity was deliberate, protective, a way to keep her close without caging her. She fell naturally into caring for him despite the changed circumstances, because his recovery was still fragile, his body still healing from trauma that should have killed him, and she found herself checking his incision sites each evening while he sat shirtless and patient, submitting to her professional touch with that slight curve to his lips that made her fingers tremble. They shared meals in a dining room that could have seated 20, but felt intimate with just the two of them, Alexander watching her taste food she could never afford on her salary, asking her questions that peeled back layers of her careful privacy. And somehow she found herself answering, telling him about the childhood that taught her self-reliance, the nursing degree financed through loans that would take decades to repay, the loneliness that came from working nights while the rest of the world slept. He reciprocated with pieces of his own history. The father who built an empire through violence and vision, the education that took him to boarding schools where he learned to hide his origins behind expensive manners, the first time he killed someone at 19, and how something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of himself. And Eleanor listened without judgment because she could see the cost of his power in the shadows beneath his eyes, the isolation that came from being simultaneously feared and needed. The attraction between them grew undeniable as days blurred together, a magnetic pull that made her hyper-aware of his presence in any room, the way his gaze followed her movements with an intensity that sent heat pooling low in her belly. And though he maintained careful physical distance, she caught him watching her with raw hunger. He did not voice. His control ironclad even as his eyes promised things that made her breath catch. She began to understand that this man who commanded empires and inspired terror had given her something no one else possessed. His vulnerability, his trust, and the realization terrified her because she was falling for someone whose world operated by rules that could destroy her, even as his presence made her feel more alive than she had in years. The week deadline arrived like an uninvited ghost, 7 days having evaporated into a routine of shared breakfasts and evening conversations and lingering looks that made Eleanor's skin feel too tight. And she woke that morning with dread pooling heavy in her stomach because she knew she should demand to leave, reclaim the normal life waiting for her in that small apartment with its cheap furniture and loneliness. But normal felt like a word from a foreign language now. something she had spoken once but could no longer remember the meaning of. Because these days with Alexander had been saturated with color and intensity, her previous existence never contained. Alexander found her in the library after breakfast, his recovery nearly complete now, moving with that controlled grace that spoke of leashed power, and he told her quietly that the threat had not diminished, that his intelligence indicated the Valdez organization was regrouping rather than retreating, but that she was free to go, that he would ensure her safety from a distance through surveillance and protection she would never see. His voice remained steady and calm, but his eyes told a different story entirely. Storm gray darkened to smoke, and she could see the plea he would not voice because men like Alexander Tremayne did not beg, did not reveal want so nakedly, but his gaze begged her to stay with an intensity that stole her breath. She opened her mouth to respond, uncertain what words would emerge, when the lights throughout the estate suddenly died, plunging them into darkness for 3 seconds before emergency systems engaged with red-tinged illumination that transformed familiar spaces into something ominous, and she heard Alexander curse softly before his hand found her wrist in a grip that was firm but careful. Henry's voice crackled through the intercom system, explaining that the outer perimeter had been breached, multiple contacts, professional coordination, and Alexander was moving before Henry finished speaking, pulling Eleanor toward the hallway with commands she barely processed through the adrenaline suddenly flooding her system. He secured her in a reinforced safe room on the first floor, all steel and concrete, and a door that locked from the inside, telling her to stay hidden until he came for her himself. And she saw the fear beneath his controlled exterior, the terror that his world had reached out to touch her with violence. The door closed and locked, and Eleanor stood alone in the dimmed space listening to muffled sounds of shouting and gunfire that seemed impossibly distant and horrifyingly close simultaneously. And she lasted perhaps 90 seconds before her hands moved to the door release, because she would not hide like a helpless thing while Alexander faced threats his body was not fully healed enough to handle. The hallway was chaos and smoke, Henry and 4 others moving in coordinated patterns, and Eleanor pressed against the wall trying to stay small and invisible as she moved toward the sounds of fighting, because every instinct screamed that Alexander needed her. She rounded the corner into the main foyer and saw the rival enforcer raising a weapon behind Alexander, who was focused on a different threat. And Eleanor did not think, simply screamed his name and threw herself forward. Henry's weapon discharged twice in rapid succession, and the enforcer crumpled before his finger could complete the trigger pull, and Eleanor felt strong hands seize her upper arms with bruising force as Alexander dragged her behind the partial cover of a marble column, his body curved around hers like a shield, while gunfire echoed through the foyer with deafening percussion that made her ears ring. The firefight lasted perhaps 90 seconds more, though time had stretched into something elastic and strange. And then silence descended, broken only by ragged breathing and the crackle of small fires where bullets had shattered expensive things. Henry barking orders into his radio, while his team secured the breached perimeter and confirmed all hostiles were neutralized. Alexander did not release her, his grip trembling now, and when Eleanor tilted her head back to tell him she was unharmed, she saw his face had gone white beneath the tan, eyes wild with something beyond fear, beyond anger, something primal and devastating that made her breath catch because she had never seen his control fracture like this. He pulled her through the chaos toward his study, ignoring Henry's attempts at debriefing, and the moment the door closed behind them, his composure shattered completely like glass under too much pressure. He rounded on her with words that came harsh and ragged, asking what she thought she was doing leaving the safe room. Did she understand she could have been killed? Did she comprehend that watching her throw herself into danger had stopped his heart more effectively than any bullet ever could? Eleanor opened her mouth to defend her actions, but Alexander was not finished, the words pouring out now as though a dam had broken, confessing that waking to her voice in that hospital room was the only thing that pulled him back from the darkness. That during the coma, her presence had been a lifeline he clung to when oblivion offered easier escape, that she had become his anchor without either of them choosing it, and now he could not imagine existence without her steady compassion grounding him. He told her he had never felt terror like what seized him when she screamed his name during the attack, that in his world, fear was currency and weakness, and he had built himself into someone incapable of it. But she had unmade that careful construction and left him vulnerable in ways that should be unacceptable, but instead felt like relief. Eleanor felt tears tracking hot down her cheeks, though she could not recall starting to cry, and she crossed the space between them to press her palms against his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her touch like a wild thing trying to escape captivity. She told him she had fallen for him impossibly and completely, that she understood the risks and chose him anyway, that she would rather stand beside him in danger than return to the safe, colorless life she had abandoned because being with him made her feel awake and vital and necessary in ways her previous existence never had. Alexander's hands came up to frame her face with a gentleness that contradicted his earlier violence, thumbs brushing away her tears, and he promised in a voice gone rough that he would build her a life where she was protected but not caged, where her compassion could flourish without her sacrificing herself to it, that he would give her everything, including the freedom to leave if she ever wished it, though the thought carved him hollow. Eleanor promised to stand beside him, to be his haven as he had become her shelter, and then his mouth was on hers, desperate and claiming, the kiss tasting of smoke and fear and relief, his fingers threading through her hair while she gripped his shoulders and kissed him back with equal hunger. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he pressed his forehead to hers and whispered that she owned him now, completely and irrevocably, and Eleanor smiled against his lips because she knew he owned her too. Eleanor did not return to the hospital, her resignation submitted through formal channels that could not be traced back to Alexander's influence, though they both knew his hand had smoothed her exit nonetheless. And in the strange floating days that followed the attack, she discovered that choosing him meant choosing a life she had to actively build rather than passively inherit, because his world operated by rules she was still learning. Alexander presented her with options. 3 different clinics he funded throughout the city that served populations existing in the margins, people connected to his organization, or simply forgotten by systems that should protect them. And Eleanor chose the one in the industrial district because it reminded her why she became a nurse in the first place, that calling to ease suffering wherever she found it. She moved fully into the estate after 2 weeks of maintaining the pretense of independence, her small apartment packed up by professionals who handled her modest possessions with the same care they would priceless artifacts, and Alexander gave her an entire wing to arrange however she wished, space that became hers in a home that might never feel entirely comfortable but grew more familiar each day. The free clinic became her anchor, 4 days each week spent treating injuries that came with implausible explanations and ailments neglected too long, and the patients learned quickly that Eleanor Ashworth asked no questions, but provided care with competence and genuine warmth that made hard men soften slightly in her presence. Henry became an unlikely friend through proximity and shared purpose. His initial suspicion transformed into protective regard, and he taught her things Alexander would not, about reading threats and staying alert. Skills she resisted learning until he told her bluntly that she could not be Alexander's weakness, that she needed to become his strength, or she would destroy them both. The Valdez organization was dismantled methodically over 6 months, key figures disappearing or turning up dead in ways that sent clear messages. And Eleanor did not ask for details because some things she preferred not to carry, though she understood the violence was executed partly to eliminate threats to her specifically. Alexander's reputation throughout the criminal network shifted subtly, whispers spreading about the nurse who had tamed the untamable Tremayne boss, speculation about whether she made him weak or dangerous in new unpredictable ways, and Eleanor heard the stories third hand with mixture of amusement and discomfort, because she had not tamed anything, simply loved him enough that he allowed himself softness in her presence. Their private moments held intimacy that still surprised her. Alexander seeking her out after difficult days to sit in quiet companionship, and she learned to read his silences, to know when he needed her touch or her words, or simply her steady presence reminding him he was more than the violence his position required. Eleanor still sometimes took his hand without conscious thought and pressed a kiss to his knuckles. The gesture became habit and promise. And now his eyes were open, gray depths watching her with devotion and hunger that made her skin flush warm. And he smiled every time, that same slight curve of his lips she had first witnessed when he was unconscious and unreachable. She understood now what that smile meant, recognition and claiming and gratitude, and she smiled back because again